You've just been contacted about a board opportunity. What happens next? Welcome to BoardVision, the official podcast of the NACD, the National Association of Corporate Directors. On this show, we share perspectives from leading corporate directors and discuss what makes boards effective, how they can help companies face challenges today, and become future ready. In this episode, NACD's Susan Paley chats with Beth Vitale, a director on multiple boards, and Chuck Gray, co-leader of Egon Zehnder's U.S. CEO and board practice, about what candidates can expect from the recruitment process, how to prepare for board interviews, and what role search firms play. Have you heard about the benefits of NACD's certification program? Today's boards operate in a dynamic and rapidly evolving world. The National Association of Corporate Directors provides directorship certification that sets the standard for high-impact board directors. It's more than certification. This is the premier program, preparing directors to successfully navigate an increasingly complex business and governance landscape. NACD's directorship certification will enable you to demonstrate commitment, deliver confidently, and create real value for your organization. Learn more and apply today at nacdonline.org. And now, your host.
Chuck Gray and Beth Vitale, thank you so much for investing time in this conversation with NACD today. We are so eager to get raring with you in this discussion because I think you have some really critical insights that I know will help our listeners. We're focusing here on one particular aspect of the pathway to the boardroom, which is the process of being recruited. After all, we know that we don't elbow our way into a boardroom. We are invited into the boardroom instead. So I think this is a really relevant conversation. And I want to start, if I can, with something of a dichotomy that I think people are living with in their minds. I mean, executives who are entering the boardroom have access to a lot of good information and a whole lot of goodness, but sometimes there are elements of it that can create a little bit of a head scratcher. And I want to clear up any cognitive dissonance that may exist. So let me start by asking you first, Beth. Some folks talk a lot about search firms. It's critical that you're in their databases. You have to be on their radar. That's the path to a first board seat or any board seat. Others are convinced that the majority of board seats, in fact, nearly all of them in many cases, those opportunities come through networking. So, Beth, from your perspective, having served on boards and been part of the recruitment process, how do we sort that out? What's true?
Well, in my opinion, even though we have Chuck on here as a search firm consultant, it's really networking. And keep in mind, you want to network with search consultants too, so that's part of it. But the majority of board seats that you actually have an opportunity to interview for are much, much, much greater that you're going to receive it through networking. Even myself, I think I've only, on all the boards that I've been on since the late 90s, I think only one of them came through a search firm that I actually landed at. Doesn't mean that they didn't reach out to me. It's just plentiful. And I think, and I'll give this to Chuck, is that, probably 20 to 30% of search firms are doing the searches for board seats. And they tend to be much larger companies that are public companies especially. So for a new board member, you probably are going to have better luck networking through your network that you have to get on maybe large nonprofits like a Dental or, an ESOP or a small micro cap company. So that's where I think that you really have a better opportunity to especially land your first, maybe second board seat by your networking. But that said, you need to be in the databases of the search firm because you never know that a company has a really, really specific skill set that they're looking for, and they may be a very large company, and you may have that skill set, and then it'll pop up for them. So I think it's really important to do both, but in general, you've got a better opportunity through networking.
Chuck, everybody I know who works at a search firm is working day and night. They're swamped. They're working on those board searches. So obviously there's a lot of action that happens there. Help us unpack that. Why do the search firms exist and how do they work? What would you say to your side of that equation from Beth's comment earlier?
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me. I would actually agree with Beth. We actually believe that most of the board placements come through the networks of the board directors of that company that the person is getting placed on. So I would completely agree with her there. There are going to be situations, though, where, if you think of a board has 11 members, typically 10, 11 independent directors. There's only so many people that those individuals know. So there can be certain searches where there is a need to get an outside party to help them out. And they call us for those searches, and we're excited to help them out in those situations. And I would say that's why we exist and why there are times where we're needed. And to be fair, we do quite a bit of work with boards. And so it's not like this is a small part of our business. It is a really big part of our business. However, I think the best advice for folks is getting to know people who sit on boards is your best opportunity and chance to get on a board.
In this recruitment process, once a candidate receives that exciting first phone call, okay, you've been selected, you're going to be on a slate. What does the process entail? Who's involved? Can you walk us through that? And maybe I'll start with you, Mary Beth, and then go to you, Chuck.
Sure. And the processes vary. So it's not like there's a playbook for non-gov committees that are doing the search here. But I think what they need to expect is that who's ever interviewing, they have looked at your either LinkedIn page, their board resume if they have it, or however they got the information that you could be a potential board member. They're looking at the skills. They've done this prior to that, and the skills they're looking for need to align with the strategy of the organization that you're a potential board member. So when that first call comes, they're going to want to verify that you truly do have the skills that is stated on your board resume or LinkedIn page or social media, wherever you're getting your word out there. The second call usually ends up being to kind of see, do you really have a fit for this board? What they know of the board, they're on the board, they know how the board works. So I think that's usually the second call you'll get there if you've passed the first one, that you've got the skills. And then after that, the process starts getting into interviewing with other people. So that first call may be the NomGov chair, it could be the CEO, but the follow-on calls could be interviewing with, the NomGov committee, because they're going to be the ones that have to recommend it to the board. There may be some C-suite that want to interview, especially if they're looking for somebody to be on the audit committee or an audit chair. They may want to have the CFO of the company to interview that person. So there's a lot of steps that go through this process, as Chuck is well aware of on this, because it's a process. People just don't make the decision on a first impression on a very serious appointment to handle the governance of an organization. So it takes time, and because there is many interviews on that. And I'd be curious to see if Chuck, if he agrees on this about the process, but it's been the one that I've experienced personally. But, as I say, there's not a playbook for this.
I mean, one of the things we try to do at the very beginning is spend quite a bit of time with the board and really understand, the board, the culture of the board, the strategy of the company, and really like what are the characteristics they're looking for in candidates. Sometimes when we actually go through this process, we actually find out that the board may not be as aligned as they think they are. And so it's good to know that up front before we actually get candidates in front of them so we can be better prepared for that. We find that upfront part is really critical because that's the part that helps us screen for potential candidates to present to the client. Once we have a sense of what is the board really looking for and the culture of the board, we put together a long list of candidates. Think of that as anywhere from 12 to 20 candidates that we share with that client. At that point, we probably haven't spoken with any of the candidates yet. We then ask the client which of those candidates would they like for us to prioritize. They usually pick a subset of that, call it 12 to 20, maybe it's 6 to 10, roughly. So think half. And we contact those individuals. If the board is looking for a very specific skill sets, for example, a former CFO or somebody who has a CFO background or a financial background, clearly all the candidates we put in front of the client are going to have that background. So we're really starting to assess at that point about, what did they accomplish in those roles? How successful were they? And then a lot of it's really their fit with the culture of the company. Does their industry align with where the company is going, et cetera? Once the process gets going, then that's where we really turn over to our clients because they're the ones who are interviewing the candidates to really assess fit from their end. So think of it as 12 to 20, which becomes 6 to 10. as you can expect, when you reach out and call individuals, sometimes the opportunity is not of interest. Sometimes the dates don't work. So that 6 to 10 becomes maybe 3 to 6. We interview those candidates, and then we present a subset of that to our clients, who then go about the process of deciding which person is the best fit for their board.
So Chuck, what you said just now brought up a couple questions in my mind. And first of all, you said something kind of quickly. I don't want to gloss over it. You said sometimes the dates don't work. I have heard that dates of board meetings can be the number one thing that boots someone out of the process. Can you speak to that for a moment?
Well, absolutely. Whenever I call a candidate and ask them if they're interested in XYZ company board opportunity, the first thing I do after that call is send them the board dates and ask them, can you check your calendar against this board calendar to make sure there are no conflicts? And that is the thing that usually bumps people off before we even get started. And I've had situations where, and this is the unfortunate part of life, sometimes you have to learn these lessons the hard way. I've had situations where you have heartbreak at the end because you didn't do that process. And so for me, it is the very first thing I do after I get off the phone with the candidate who's raised their hand.
Right. No nom and gov chair wants to spend time, energy, and money on a search firm to find out that their top candidate can't come to 3/4 of the board's meetings, right?
That would not be good for my career.
No, that would not. Or for theirs. Okay, so Chuck, let me pursue one more thing before I toss it back over to Mary Beth. And that is that you talked about this process where you go from 12 to 20 down to maybe half a dozen to the lucky 1 or 2. I almost can feel a palpable sense of white knuckling on the part of candidates as they're hopefully going to be part of that 1 to 2 group. And all that sounds logical, right? All of us as executives have hired people. And we know we start with a large field and a large net, and then we whittle it down. So that makes sense. What do you think a candidate listening today should know about working with a recruiting firm that may not be an apparent element, that may be a little bit of a secret, or that you'd want them to know about working with a recruitment firm?
That's interesting. That's a really interesting question. Yeah, I like that question. I mean, not that I don't like the other questions, but I really like that question. It's like, because it sort of helps me help them, right? So I would actually say if they can help us help them. And what I mean by that is really helping us understand their story so we can bring that story to our clients. I always say it's not, sometimes I have candidates who will say, oh my gosh, this should be so easy. This is straightforward. And I say, I hear you when you say that, but you have to, if I can't tell your story, the client won't be interested. So what I have with some candidates is they make their background so complex and convoluted as they describe it that I can't adequately tell their story to the client. So I always tell people simpler is better. Basic things like who you report to and size of your team and organization, and, what are the couple of key points in the strategy, and what are one of your 2 key accomplishments? I mean, those are the types of things I'm looking for. I have a lot of candidates for board search who really try to take me back to their childhood. And I'm not saying I'm not interested. I actually am quite curious about these things, but it's not going to be as relevant for me telling the story in the 30 seconds I have with the client to bring their story to life. So if they can help me in that 30 seconds I have with the client to bring their story to life, that's a really critical part of this process. We do look at the board bios. What I would tell people when it comes to the board bios is spend time on them, make sure they're right, make sure they're accurate, but don't sweat the board bio. I was on a panel once with a bunch of recruiters, and we all kind of laughed at each other because we all agreed that we would actually much rather have the resume of the candidate than the bio of the candidate. Because recruiters, most of us have been trained to look at resumes in our career, so we can much more quickly get a grasp of a person and their background. We actually look at their resume versus reading through their bio. So when you're sending information to a recruiter, we actually recommend that you send the bio and the resume to their recruiter, because once again, it helps them bring your story to life a lot quicker. Those are a couple quick things. There's others, but those are a couple quick things in mind.
Yeah, I heard you using the word story a couple times, and I love that as someone who's a storyteller as well. Chuck is saying, I'm asking you for help so that you can help me help you. Don't make my job harder. I need to be able to tell your story concisely. And so that's a brilliant piece of advice. Mary Beth, from the other direction of being a candidate or all the experience you have in this process, what advice would you have for candidates who are preparing themselves for board service, specifically whether it's presenting their assets like the board bio and resume and the storytelling and the interview itself?
Well, I think you don't want to underestimate the interviewer's capability, especially if you're interviewed by a recruitment firm, that they have done a thorough research on you before they probably ever have spoken with you. They may not have done background checks because you're not to that point yet. But, one thing when I was preparing for this, I wrote down, conflicts. I think there's lots of conflicts. One is the board calendar that Chuck just described, but do you have conflicts between the company, non-compete and all of those types of things? A lot of times when you have people that are retired audit firm people that were auditors, they may not be able to go to clients that are currently in there. So you need to know that aspect. But the other thing I think is that when you're talking with the interviewer, try not to overly exaggerate anything you have on it, because I say they're going to do their search, but also you need to help them. Just as Chuck said, is make sure that your resume, LinkedIn, board resume, all of that is up to date. You've put the skills in because they're matching it, whether it be a recruiter or a non-gov chair, based on the skills they need. So doing that and making sure you've got that identified in whatever form helps them know that you have that opportunity. And I think, Chuck, really highlighted and did a good job about it in terms of, what were your successes? What were your failures and how did you overcome them? Those types of questions, to have those answers when you get into that interview.
So Chuck and Mary Beth, you both covered just now sort of key pieces of information to convey, story being key, but also having it concise enough. What about what's behind the words? What kind of mindset does a candidate need to have when they enter this process?
What I would say from a candidate perspective is that it's really critical to understand that you're interviewing for a board and not an executive role. It's really, really critical. And I've had candidates who have interviewed for board roles as if they're interviewing for executive roles, and they have not been very successful. So what do I mean by that? You're not going to need to give as much detail about the things you've done in your career as you will for an executive role. You're going to need to pay a lot more attention to cues from the person you're speaking with to, maybe keep it brief, maybe keep it higher level. Boards want individuals who are strategic. Yes, they will probably like the fact that you've been a strong operator, but they really want somebody who's going to be strategic because they have people running the company. They're not hiring you to run the company. And I see those are a few examples of I see just people not having the right mindset. The other thing I would say is that understanding the difference between management and being a board director. The interesting thing is that the caliber of people that we want to put in front of clients for board search are people who are already probably presenting to their own board of directors, and they should have empathy for what it's like to be on the other side of the table, or said differently, because they're on the other side of the table, they should really have an understanding of what their favorite directors are like and what their not favorite directors are like, who are across the table from them. And so being able to put themselves in a situation so that when they go and have the interview, they understand that it's more about governance and less about management. And so when they're talking about how they will show up in the boardroom, the types of things they'll do, making sure that as part of that process, they make it clear that they understand that distinction.
Great. Mary Beth, what would you say from your perspective about mindset along those lines?
Oh, I've got a great comment about that, because I see so many potential board members that I have to interview as a chair of a NomGov or chair of the board that I serve on make this mistake. I think the biggest thing is that your conversation in that interview needs to have a mindset around how can you be of value to the company in terms of achieving their strategic goals and initiatives, versus I hear a lot of people say, well, I'm going to retire and I want something good to do that is intellectually stimulating. I have that happen a lot of time, especially with potential board members that are in that position that they're retiring. That's what they say to me on the first call when they want to chat with me. And I almost always eliminate them from the search, because they're not thinking that the board is looking for how can you help us achieve the goals and strategy. All the things that Chuck mentioned are absolutely critical, but the mindset has to be, what do I bring to the table?
Can I follow up on that point really quickly? I mean, Mary Beth, I think, my gosh, I feel like I could spend an hour on this topic. I speak with a lot of people who are seeking board opportunities. And I always like to ask the question of them, like, why do you want to do this? And I can tell many of them are not quite prepared for that question because they start to give the answer you just gave, Mary Beth, about, I just want to do something intellectually stimulating and my career is winding down and want to make sure I have something to do. And I'm not saying that might not be an underlying reason why you're considering board service, but I always say, like, that's not going to get a company excited about you, right? Is really to your point about, what can you bring to the board that ideally they don't have, or what can you bring to the board to maybe complement what they do have? And I think it's a really critical thing for folks to think about. Why do they want to do this, and what do they think they can bring to the table when they actually do seek a board?
Yeah, the thing that came up for me when both of you were speaking, Chuck and Mary Beth, is that when I'm interviewing for a board seat, I should monitor how often the subject of the sentence is me, I, or my. It should predominantly be you as a board appear to be heading here. Here's how I can help you, right?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think in general, I think being a bit too egocentric in these discussions is not going to be the successful strategy. So completely agree. But I do. I hate to get into the point of, like a good or a bad reason to join a board. I mean, I don't want to judge people that way, right? But I do think people need to really think about, why this is and what they want to do. And I have so many people who say, and I'll say, look, these are the types of board searchers I work with. And they say, oh my gosh, I would love to be on a board like that. And I would say, okay, I hear you. We had a lot of people who were interested in those boards, but it's I have to say this in the right way, right? I say it's kind of not about you, right? It's really about what that company needs around the table at that particular point in their history. And not even just today, but also what they need around the table as they go forward as an organization. So to your point, I hate to say it, but it's really not about that person. It's really about what the company needs as they're going toward the future.
So we're camping out here for a minute on the interview, and I want to stay there. You mentioned, Chuck, that so often people make the mistake of approaching it as if it were an executive position. And I had a seasoned director tell me once, it's different when you're on a board. You are interviewing them as much as they are interviewing you. Now, whether or not that's true, if it's really equal parts, it does trigger our thinking to remember you're in that room to perhaps ask information, ask queries. So I'll start with you, Mary Beth. What questions should a candidate pose to the board that they're interviewing with?
Well, that's a great question, Susan. And I think to start off, to help them is first to ask, what are the skills and attributes that company is looking for? So if you get that out on the table, it is helpful. Now, if you're going through a recruiter, they would have sent you the specs, ahead of time, but that doesn't happen for all the networking opportunities you get. So you want to know what they're looking for so that you can highlight the skills and attributes and experiences you have based on that need. So that's one thing I would start with. You definitely need to have done your research ahead of time about the company, whether it be SEC documents, social media, web pages, whatever it is. If you know, there's lots of ways to get information on it. But if you found that maybe there was some financial concerns, if it was a public company, I think that's a question you want to ask. Like, gee, I read your, most recent 10K, and can you help me with this? The other things that I think are really important that a lot of times do not get asked by a prospective candidate is, what's the culture of the board? So how do you guys interact? What's the feeling there? What's your process and procedures and common practices? And then secondly, culture of the organization. And are they aligned? Because you need to know will that culture, will I fit in? Will this be something I want to do? And lastly, which is just a basic blocking and tackling, especially if it's a very small company that's either public but corporate company, do they have D&O insurance? And if they don't, do not. Stop sign, red flags, do not go on that board. Maybe you could be a consultant, maybe you can be an advisor, but if they don't have D&O insurance, even though you think this company is wonderful and nothing bad will happen, bad things do happen to good companies. So I think that those would be if it's a very small company. Most companies today have D&O insurance, but if it's a small one, you need to ask those questions. So I think it's important to understand what they're looking for to help you in that particular interview.
So Chuck, Mary Beth just mentioned doing your research, certainly D&O insurance, and she touched on culture. I'm curious, in your experience, having witnessed a lot of searches, how honest an answer can someone on the board give about the culture on the board itself and at the entire enterprise?
So what I would say is usually candidates, when they're going through the interview process, they meet several directors. Sometimes they meet the full board, but they're going to probably at least meet the CEO, the lead director / chair if it's not the CEO, and then the governance committee. So they're probably going to meet at least 5 people, most likely, who sit on the board. And what we would recommend is to ask the same question of all 5 people. And if the answers are aligning, then that's probably the truth. If you find that the answers are a bit all over the place, or people flinch when they start answering the question, or they get nervous and they see the answer to the question, that probably tells you what you need to know about the culture of the board.
Great answer. I'm imagining also if they each had the exact same verbiage, they might be reading from a talking point if they were all saying the exact same thing.
Yes, and you can kind of trust your instincts when you get in those situations.
Beautiful. So you both spoke about speaking to other people in the interview process, the governance committee, or sometimes it's called nominating governance, the chair, the CEO, maybe a few other C-suite officers. What other aspects of the board recruitment process go beyond just what we've talked about in terms of interviews or meeting with key players? What kind of maybe informal aspects are happening behind the scenes? And Mary Beth, I'll start with you, and then we'll see if Chuck has any addition.
Sure. Besides the people that you mentioned that you would most likely be interviewing with, I think especially if you are being considered for a audit chair or audit member to the committee, I think a very legitimate request, and I have always done this, is to ask to speak to the external auditors. Now, they'll have to arrange that for you, but you want to know ahead of time, do they have any concerns? Because you don't want to get yourself in a situation that is that going down south, and you're culpable at that point. So I think it's important to understand that, and it could clarify maybe some business models that you're not understanding how they really make money from looking at what has been published, if that's the case. So I think that is one area of an external person that you may want to. If they have legal counsel, if you've got, just want to understand their governance structure and understand that besides what's put on the website of their governance documents, that may be appropriate. I've not ever done that myself, but I definitely have done the external auditors when I was being considered for an audit chair of a financial holding company.
So Chuck, in addition to being curious about what else you would add to Mary Beth's answer about what informal aspects we may not know about in this process, I'm curious about when she talks about talking to an external audit chair. I'm sure that the board and company don't open that conversation very easily. So my ask is, does that happen when the candidate is one of the 12 to 20 you talked about, of the 6 you talked about, of the final 1 or 2? When do I get to ask to talk to somebody like a CFO or an auditor in that case?
That's going to be, that's probably when it's becoming clear that you're the candidate, or you're one of the final couple of people. Practically speaking, it's a bit ahead of the curve if you're meeting with the external auditor before you meet several other members of the board of directors themselves. And so that's going to be as you start to get toward the end of the process, where, it's another opportunity for you to speak with people who can give you a better sense of how the company works.
I totally agree with Chuck on that. Yeah, the company would never allow all these candidates to go talk to the external auditors. So it's pretty clear you are the person most likely, and now you are doing your due diligence. Is this the right company for me? It kind of switches a little bit in terms of who has the deciding factor at that point.
This also works, in the other direction as well. I would just tell candidates that, make sure you have a good handle on your own reputation. Because what I find when candidates interview with the board, there are oftentimes people on the board who if they don't know the candidate, they know that candidate's boss or people who work with that candidate, or if they're maybe a person who's served on other boards and known people that have served on boards with them, and they will do their own referencing, and they may not even tell us as a recruiter until after the fact. And so I always tell people, when you're going through this process, what will your CEO say about you? What will the board of the company that you work for say about you as an executive? Because they may get asked that question, and just make sure you're clear what they're going to say about you before you start entering these processes. I've seen it happen time and time again with people who, did not do that work or thought everything was great. And we've had clients who say, yeah, we know about Joe and we think we're going to pass. And that's all you get. But I know that's code for they did some checking behind the scenes and that person is not going to be right fit for them.
So you just said that person's not going to be right for them. And a minute ago, Mary Beth said something around this may not be the right board for you. So I'm going to combine those two, the spirit of those two statements, and say that the thing that's coming up for me now that I'm curious about is, how do we think through a candidate's thought process or recommended process around assessing if a board opportunity is actually right for them? I mean, when you join a board, sometimes you're getting crazy calls on the weekend when the board is in a bit of a crisis. You're traveling all over the place. You really put in blood, sweat, and tears. You want to make sure that it's the right fit in both directions. How do you assess that in this process?
A lot of times it comes down to the person and what they really are looking for. I try to help candidates think about what do they want out of their board services. That's something they're really interested in. Is it an understanding of a new industry? Is it, I had a candidate who joined the board of a company actually smaller than the company he works for, but he wanted to be a CEO, and this company had a lot of CEOs on the board. I said, you have a built-in group of mentors already joining this board. And so for him, it was the other directors and their backgrounds, which he found fascinating. So it's really like spending time thinking through the company, where you are in your career, the directors are on the board, and just getting a sense of what does this do for me in my career? What can I get out of this? Once again, it's less about you and more about the company, but there is a part that is about you, and you should make sure you get something out of this as well. But I hate to say this, but I would just say you kind of know. I mean, and Mary Beth is probably a better person to answer because she's actually been through this a lot. But just speaking with candidates, they just sort of know. They're like, this is the right board, and it's almost like moving into a house. You just sort of know, and you may not know until you actually get there. But then you're like, you know what, this is home.
Great image, Mary Beth. What would you add?
Well, I think it is. You've got to, once you've met with the majority of the board members and the key management people, it may be the CEO, CFO, and a COO. I think what the critical point is that you're going to be spending not just 4 meetings a year with these individuals. You're going to be spending more time than that, because now I think the average is 5 or 6 meetings a year for sure. And that's if nothing's going wrong. Or if you're acquiring a company or you're doing positive things too, it's going to take time and energy. So you need to make an assessment, as Chuck has talked about. You're going to know, are these the people that you want to depend on their judgment? You want to make sure, the old adage, if you're all in the boat together, are the guns pointed in the same direction? And that these are people that you're going to be able to trust, or, you have to build that. But you got to have a sense that these are people I want to spend some time with and help to make the positive decisions for on the benefit of the shareholders, stakeholders, all of that. So I think that's where your hat has to be. to know that, okay, I want to be with these individuals and I want to be with part of this company to make it a success.
Chuck, if it turns out at the end of that assessment, an individual decides, you know what, this doesn't feel right. It doesn't feel like home. This is not the right fit. What's an elegant way to exit that situation without burning any bridges, so you're not talked about in any way other than glowingly when they are asked next time about you?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's a heartbreaking moment for a recruiter, but it's not about me. I will leave that aside for a second. I mean, look, I would just say, look, I think earlier is better than later. Okay. So when candidates are interviewing and I try to get back with them, even after their first discussions and just get a sense of where they are, I really push them to be honest about where their head is and where their heart is on this. And there are some situations where the client is incredibly interested and we do want to do a bit of a sales process. And so we will push a bit for them to meet other people. But I would tell people, if you really don't feel like this is your thing, letting people know earlier than later is the best approach you can take. Mm-hmm. And being thankful and gracious for the time is the way to go. I've seen this happen where people go and wait to the very end, or maybe there's another board opportunity that comes up, as they're going through the process. I mean, look, if Microsoft calls you in the middle of a process, I mean, I don't think anybody's going to penalize you for that. But, it is frustrating to a board when they invest a lot of time and you do say no at the very, very end. And I always tell people, understand that these directors are very interconnected throughout the world. And so your reputation will follow you much further than you think it will. So just keep that in mind. But earlier is better than later.
Chuck, and I want to get your input on this, Mary Beth. But first, Chuck, when you do give that answer, would you recommend giving a why, or is it simply no as a complete sentence and you just say no?
Oh, a why? I think you should. I mean, I think they're going to want to know, why is this not interesting? And I think you should be open about, what it is, because you never know. Sometimes I've had situations where a candidate said, I don't think this is big enough for me. I'm just making it up. And they have conversations to really understand, actually, this business is much more complex than I thought it was, as an example. So sometimes when you get to the why, you can address those issues that may not even really be issues at the end of the day. So I don't think people should be afraid to say why. I do think that you have to be careful about making it personal, right? If it's gosh, I just think this CEO is a scumbag. I don't think you want to say that. Right? Noted. But I think you can say, hey, I just don't feel the fit works for me right now. Right. That's always a fair way to get out of it if you have to.
Yeah. Mary Beth, how would you respond?
Well, I had a situation just like this, and we had sold a bank and a financial institution. And so I was getting calls very rapidly from other banking institutions to go on their board. And one was moving very quickly. And these were not coming from a recruiter. So I think what had happened there as they're going through the process, I'd even gone to their location, met with people. It was a very delicate situation. They had not told me what the compensation was for this. It was a paid board. And it's like, and I'll ask Chuck this to have him opine on this afterwards, is like, when do you do this when you don't have a search firm to kind of buffer that? But they were specifically looking for a woman, and they were looking for a woman that could be a financial expert on their board, which I checked off all of those boxes. And so when it got very close that I was going to be the candidate, which they moved much quicker than I thought that I was at that point, I asked them, okay, what's the time commitment you're really expecting here? And then I had to say, what is the compensation? And given the time commitment and the compensation, and it would eliminate me from ever going on another bank board because it would be a conflict. That was not I wasn't going to do that. It wasn't worth, the juice wasn't worth the squeeze on this. So, or the squeeze is not worth the juice. I'm not sure which the way it is. But so what I did when they said, boy, you're going to meet monthly and you're going to have to do all of these other things, I said to them, look, this is not going to work for me for the reasons I've just given you all. And then I suggested the CFO from the bank that we just sold, who was a woman. And I said, here's another candidate that could probably fill your slot perfectly. And so I didn't want to leave them high and dry because they really wanted to. They were wanting to move very quickly. So I think I handled it well, I hope. And, but I would be curious to see from Chuck, like when you're not with a recruiter, when do you ask that question? Because is it worth my time to do it, to know what the compensation is?
Well, a couple of things. I just want to make sure I don't lose this point. I mean, I had a search recently solved by a candidate who said no and then recommended another candidate who actually was a winning candidate. So a great way to get out of something is if you can identify another great candidate who has a similar background to yours. Recruiters love that. That actually helped me solve a search recently. So I think that's a really good point, Mary Beth. And then from a compensation perspective, I mean, if it's a public company, the compensation should be public information in the proxy statement.
Right. This was private.
If it's a private company, then that's going to be, I think you can, I wouldn't ask it the first conversation, but I think if the first conversation goes well, I think after that, it's a fair thing to ask, kind of how are you thinking about compensation? I found private boards, compensation is all over the map. And oftentimes the private equity firm or the venture capital firm sometimes hasn't even thought it through completely, to be honest with you. So in some ways, asking the question actually does them a favor because they need to start getting their minds around that.
Yeah. Such an interesting detail that's so critical in so many places. So as we are heading toward the wrap up of our conversation, I'm going to ask you in just a moment to maybe offer a final piece of wisdom to our listeners. But before I do that, I just wonder if there's any insight you can provide us about that last piece of the puzzle. Let's imagine we've gone through a successful process. We are selected. It's a great fit. We're going to step into the boardroom. If I'm so used to being a candidate, and then suddenly, I have my first board meeting next week. What's that transition in just a brief moment look like in terms of when do I have that final process in place that makes me an official new board member? I'll ask you first, Chuck, from a process perspective, then Mary Beth, maybe you can bring us home on that.
Sure. I actually was probably going to say go to Mary Beth first in this one because she's on the board. But I mean, so you go through interviews, we do the references, you have to go through a background check. Once all of that's done, and every board is a bit different, but the board usually once everything is interviewed and all the background and reference checks are completed, they vote. Oftentimes it's a committee, then as a board, whether to elect that person to the board. And then depending on the time of year, which can get into a bit of a longer conversation, you want to make sure that person is in the proxy statement so they can be voted on by the shareholders. I mean, that's a very, very quick overview of it. And I'll turn it to Mary Beth to add more of the details that I may have missed.
Yeah, Chuck, I think you hit on most of the things I was going to talk about. I think if it's a public company, you can be hired when it isn't around a shareholder meeting to put you in the proxy. So you can hire midterm. Just an 8K needs to be released to let people know, and then you're voted on by the shareholders at that next meeting. But I think the one little tip I would give is usually at that point, they're making those decisions around a board meeting. And usually if you're the candidate, they voted on you, you're going to be invited to the board dinner. So that's usually a common practice. I've been invited to a lot of them. And before I went on the large financial holding company and bank that I was on, I was being under consideration, but I don't know that I was the number one person on it. They had another person that was invited to the board dinner. Well, this person didn't behave well and overserved themselves. So within a nanosecond, I was then asked to join this board. And I stayed on that board for 14 years. And it was a fabulous board. So my advice in that case is you are still being evaluated at that board dinner, and they can change their mind easily on that and not go forward. So I've seen that happen.
Whew, that's a story, Mary Beth. All right. Well, my wrap up was going to be to ask you for a piece of advice. Was that your piece of advice?
Well, that's one piece of advice. Most people don't behave that way, and I think they have a knowledge of that. But I think the one piece of advice that I would just say today, when we talk about the call, back to the first question about how do you get on the board, networking. And I think a lot of people don't know how to network. It's not just handing out your business cards to everybody you come in contact with, but have a plan, be purposeful and thoughtful. The people that are going to at least get you in front of the decision makers tend to be recruiters, SEC attorneys for that firm, audit firms that are servicing that particular company, other board members you may know that somebody knows who they are that serve on that board. I think the other thing that I always talk about is that when you get opportunities to get in front of people to speak, say yes. I say yes to everything. I said yes to this podcast because I know Chuck and Susan well, and I think you need to let people know that you are interested in getting on board service. So I think you need to have your networking to get on the board to be much more purposeful than just haphazard.
Chuck, what about your advice and wisdom as we leave this group?
I would tell people, board service does not take the place of a great operating role. And it may not be the thing people want to hear, but I always tell people, be great at your operating role. And the better you are at your operating role, the more opportunities you're going to create for yourself from a board perspective. I've seen people who focus almost more on their board service and operating role and wind up changing jobs and things like that. And that actually makes it harder for you to join a board. So it's one piece of advice. I think sometimes we forget that the main thing is the main thing, and people should keep that in mind.
Great. Well, we're so grateful for the bits of information and insight you've lent our audience today. I know they're going to keep on following this saga as we present other programming and articles and so forth. So thanks for being part of that conversation to both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That concludes this episode of BoardVision. We hope you enjoyed listening. Please subscribe and join us next time. Until then, visit nacdonline.org to stay informed about the latest resources NACD has to offer, such as memberships, certification, national or chapter events, and our content, including reports, articles, and Directorship Magazine. That's nacdonline.org. Thank you for listening.